Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 7 Climate Science. This is video number 23. We're going to be looking at reducing the human footprint. The focus of this video is to investigate scientific evidence suggesting ways in which humans may assist to minimise any human contribution to the greenhouse effect in your daily life. So what is the carbon footprint? Well, the carbon footprint is basically the amount of greenhouse gas that each person is responsible for. Now, every time we breathe out, we're going to be releasing a small amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, that's okay. It's a very small amount, but a lot of the activities that we're involved in, a lot of the products that we consume actually release a lot more carbon dioxide. So whilst there's nothing we can do to completely avoid releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, there are certainly some things that make it much worse, or at least contribute to a higher than what might be an average amount of carbon dioxide being added. So some of the things that we do might be related to our use of electrical power. Unfortunately, in this country, we still have a lot of our electrical generation from coal power stations, and that is slowly changing, but certainly we're nowhere near the sort of number of things that we see around the world where there's a lot of countries that are now embracing alternate energy sources. And we'll have a look at some of those a little bit later on. We need to think about the food we eat, where we source that from, how fresh it is, and also what sort of land clearing, as we've talked about in previous videos, might have been associated with the production of that agriculture, and also what sort of fossil fuels might be being burnt in the processes of preparing the land, growing the crops, harvesting the crops, processing those crops, and then transporting them to the supermarkets and ultimately to our tables. And of course that works out even worse if we move from plants to animals. There's another step in that process as well as the increase in certain types of gases like methane, which are part of a lot of livestock production. Textiles, the clothing that we wear, what we do around our homes, how energy efficient our homes are, what we use for heating and cooling, for example. All of these are factors that can contribute to our personal carbon footprint. When we looked at some recent figures, I noticed that the average Australian contributes about 28 tonnes per year of towards the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is a frighteningly large total, and we are punching well above our weight in this particular area. If you look at the fact that in order for things to be kind of maintained at a status quo, then the world average is about 8 tonnes per person. So that's considerably less than what we currently are producing. But that doesn't meet the target either. So if we wanted to actually set ourselves possible targets for reducing some of the impacts that we've seen relating to climate science, then we actually have to get that back to 4 tonnes. Now that's dropping the average down by half, but for us in Australia, that's actually going down by a factor of 7. So that's a very big target and something that's actually going to require significant change. And you would think that that change is going to have to come at government level. So it would be easy at this point, I guess, to just say, well, this is a bigger problem than just me, so there's not a lot that I can do about it. But of course, we all know that there's plenty of people who have just on their own been able to make a huge difference. And so that's what we're after here. We're after trying to make a difference. One of the ways that we can do that is to go through a little checklist. And there's a couple of websites online where you can go in, do a bit of a carbon survey, get a bit of an idea of the sort of levels of carbon dioxide that you may already be producing, or at least the sort of impact that you might be personally having on the climate. But one of the things that we can all do is take some personal responsibility for some of the choices that we make, recognizing the importance of trying to leave this legacy to our children and our children's children. So the first thing we want to do is we want to try and reduce personal waste. So we want to think about the things that we're throwing away. Here, our local governments collect different types of recycled materials on different types of days. We have colour coding on our bins in order to identify which types of materials are being recycled. That could include bins for garden waste. It could include paper, cardboard, bottles, cans, those sorts of things. Thinking about how much of what we use ends up in landfill is a really important way of trying to reduce your carbon footprint. We can also eat less red meat, and these three things really go nicely together. One of the things that has happened is that we have started to drink a lot of bottled water. So rather than the tap water, and of course the tap water is important because it has dental additives designed to help improve our dental hygiene and health, but it also doesn't require the sort of storage and manufacturing that goes into, for example, producing plastic bottles full of water. So at an absolute minimum, we want to try and make sure that we're recycling the bottles that we use. So we're not just buying more plastic bottles all of the time. This is a real negative on our environment. But it's also better if we eat fresh. If we try and think about fresh fruits and vegetables, fresh foods have less processing, and therefore they're less likely to have the associated high carbon footprint consequence that we would have if we're eating processed foods. And the other thing about red meat is that it's one less step in the food chain. So if we think about our producer going to our herbivore, going to our carnivore, then if we take our producer and go straight to our herbivore, and this is us as opposed to this is us, then we're going to knock one step less in the food chain. And there's a lot of energy savings that are going on there. It's roughly 10% that you move from one level to another. So 10% of the energy moving on, which means basically only 1% of the original energy coming through. So you get 10 times that if you can cut one of those levels out of your food chain. Kangaroo meat, of course, is a potential option for those of us in Australia where we have a huge number of native kangaroos in our region, sometimes to the point where they're almost a nuisance. That would be an alternative. Kangaroo meat's obviously one of those things that's a personal preference, but certainly it could be an alternative to the aggressive sort of livestock farming that we have for the production of our current red meat supplies. We live in a time too where maybe 50 years ago, a lot of people used to repair things. If things broke down, they figured out how to give them a new lease on life, continued to reuse materials that they'd bought a long time ago. We're in the disposable society, unfortunately, now. So we don't tend to do much repairing or reusing or even recycling. We tend to throw it away and buy something new. Think about, just in a small amount of time of your own life, or perhaps a little longer, how many phones you've had and what you've done with each of those phones. Have you recycled them? Have you put them in a collection point? Have you passed them on to a younger person, a younger relative, for example, or have they just ended up somewhere in some landfill? Home heating is one of the big areas, and not just heating, also cooling, as I mentioned before, is an area where we can think about creative ways about good housing design that perhaps is going to reduce our need for running things like air conditioners constantly. If you do one of the online carbon surveys, one of the things you'll notice is that if you are a frequent flyer, you really are putting a lot of pressure on the environment. People who fly a lot often have higher carbon footprints, even if in some other areas they're doing really, really well. Transport at the moment is still dominated by the use of fossil fuels for generating the energy that's needed. And so therefore, these sorts of areas are really a big place where we can think about how we are traveling. But we can also do that on a smaller level too. Do we carpool? A lot of travel is still undertaken by a single person driving a car with no one else in it. And even after a long time in COVID isolation, where we weren't using cars a lot, which was really good for our environment, we've come back to that. So are there ways of carpooling? Are there ways of using public transport? Or even walking, which may be occasionally an option, not if you're a long distance away, but ways of trying to look for minimizing that use of fossil fuels if you possibly can. And I guess the final one, and we'll look at these separately, are alternate energy sources. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot more of on houses these days are solar panels. And solar panels are another great way of being able to produce energy. There are costs associated with that. There are also downsides in terms of the requirement for light in order for the solar panels to work. And so therefore maybe some way of being able to store the energy to be able to use that later on when the sun's not out or at night, those sorts of things. So there's lots of areas that we can talk about in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. And what's important is to think about exactly how much carbon you are using, what the source of that carbon is, and how much of that is being recycled back into the atmosphere, and how much of it is under your control. It's an important thing to be self-reflective in this kind of an area. Thanks for watching.